Have you ever wondered if you are already living your dream? You're just living the shadow version of it. The way an aspiring novelist becomes an English teacher, endlessly analysing other people's books instead of writing their own. The way an entrepreneur at heart works as a consultant, advising others how to build companies whilst never actually starting one themselves. The way a painter working at an art gallery, surrounded by creativity all day, but never actually has time to put their own paintbrush on their own canvases. Steven Pressfield has a name for this. He calls it a shadow calling, and it's one of the most insidious traps that the human mind can create. The shape of a shadow career is similar to your true calling. Their contours feel tantalizingly the same. You're still surrounded by words or business or art or music, whatever that thing is that you're looking for. It feels like you're close to the thing you love, but here's the real test that Pressfield gives you. If you failed in this shadow career tomorrow, would the consequences be truly meaningful to you, or would you feel secretly a little relieved? The amateur, Steven Pressfield says, fears that if he turns pro and lives out his calling, he will have to live up to who he really is and what he is truly capable of. So instead, we choose safety wrapped in a metaphor. We stay close enough to smell what we want, but far enough away that we never have to actually risk trying. It's a bit like driving around your neighborhood for an hour in circles instead of driving an hour out of town to the place you've always wanted to visit. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast, where we review self-improvement with a scientific lens and take a tour through the philosophy of what it means to live a life well lived. I am Sam Webster Harris, and today I am talking about one of my favorite books ever, called Turning Pro by Steven Pressfield. If you've ever held a secret desire in you to dedicate yourself towards a calling, I could not recommend a better book. It's full of growth mindset lessons, and today I'm going to teach you a few of the best ones, so please stay tuned. Let's start with Steven Pressfield's own shadow career. In his late 20s and early 30s, Steven was driving trucks up and down the east coast of America. Not as a temporary gig, not as something between writing projects. He was dead set, earnest about making a life as a trucker. And why trucking, you might ask? Because in his imagination, being a truck driver was a powerful and manly thing to do. Just as he imagined being a writer would be, it was about honest labor, it took courage, rolling over mountains at night in the dark, it had the romance of the road. All the same contours of the writer's life that he was terrified to try and live. But here was the problem. The road was taking him nowhere. He wasn't writing books. He wasn't facing his real demons. During those years, Steven kept his Smith Corona typewriter with him in his van, but it was buried under junk and spare parts. He knew it was there, and he thought about it constantly, but he was terrified of sitting down at it and trying to actually write something. Inside, he was ashamed. He knew he was scared to act. It took many years for the truth to sink in that everything in his outer life, the trucking, the aimlessness, the shadow career, was a consequence of that terror and shame that he was feeling. He gives a few other examples in his book of shadow careers that might sound familiar or resonate with you. Getting a PhD in Elizabethan studies because you're afraid to write the tragedies and comedies inside you. Living the drugs and booze half of the musician's life without actually writing music. Or performing in a cover band instead of performing your own rock songs. Or working in a support capacity for an innovator because you're afraid to become one yourself. Each of these things looks like progress. Each one keeps you close to your calling, but none of them require you to actually answer your calling. So let's move on to the concept of metaphor. At his lowest point, Steven lived in a halfway house in Durham, North Carolina. It's a boarding station for patients emerging from state mental hospitals. Yet, he wasn't a mental patient himself. He'd gotten fired from his job delivering frozen industrial food to restaurants, and he was in such a state of shame that he couldn't face his wife or his mother-in-law, so he rented a basement room for almost nothing in this halfway house. As he puts it, the law of metaphor had brought me there. The dominant emotion pervading every centimeter of that place was fear. Everyone there had experienced a disintegration of their personality. They'd fallen hard and alone, and they'd been staring their own annihilation in the face. And basically, everyone he was living with was just shattered. And there was Steven, living among them, not because he'd had a psychotic break, but because he'd been living a shadow life for so long that he'd ended up in the exact same physical location that best represented his mental state. Afraid. He But then one day he had a dream. He walked into his basement room, and instead of the usual disaster, everything had organized itself. His shirts had been folded, his boots had shined themselves and were sitting in perfect order, and in the dream, a thought surfaced in complete clarity. He realized he was ambitious. I have ambition. He wanted to do something with his life. What's interesting was that after realizing this, his initial response was guilt, because he wondered who he was to aspire to rise above the brothers and sisters he was living with in the halfway house. But then he realized that to feel ambition and to act upon it is to embrace the unique calling of our souls. If you don't act on it, if you ignore your ambition just because of the people around you, that is literally turning your back on yourself and the reason for your existence. So the lesson is, don't let people hold you back, and do think about the metaphor of the situations and what they might be telling you about your life. Right, on the subject of shadows, Stephen says the shadow life has a partner called addiction. When we're living as amateurs, we are running away from our calling, meaning our work, our destiny, the obligation to become our truest and highest selves, and instead, addiction becomes a surrogate for our calling. And just like the metaphor example, addictions aren't random. It's not necessarily just weakness or bad luck. It's often a substitute for the life you're meant to live. We can enact addiction instead of embracing the calling. And why is that? Well, to follow a calling requires hard work. It's difficult, it hurts, it demands entering the pain zone of effort, risk, and exposure. Some addictions can be very obvious, like alcohol, drugs, food. Others can seem perfectly respectable at a distance, say spending time on social media, spending time in meetings and networking, taking courses, getting certifications, instead of doing lots of things that you can be doing that distract from doing the actual work. Maybe you read about writing instead of writing. Perhaps you research your business idea for the 7th year in a row. As he says, the amateur tweets and talks about doing things, whereas the professional works. Whatever addiction we fall into, instead of composing our symphony, we create a shadow symphony where we ourselves are the orchestra, the conductor, the composer, and the audience. Our life becomes a shadow drama, a shadow startup company, a shadow creative practice. Stephen even says his life used to be a shadow novel. It had a plot, characters, sex scenes, action scenes. It had mood, atmosphere, texture. It was scary, it was weird, it was exciting. There was only one problem. None of it involved writing a real novel or painting a real painting or starting a real business. And that is the shadow life in essence. You perform all the emotional drama of being an artist without actually making any art. You're living the tortured entrepreneur lifestyle without building a business. All the suffering, but no output. You can give yourself all the difficulty and suffering of the work of a professional, which helps give you the excuses to not do the hard work. So you know how to deal with hardship, but your fear stops you from really applying it in the right way. Now this moves us into a conversation about amateur behavior versus professional, and what's the real difference between someone living a shadow life and someone who has turned pro. Well, basically this episode is actually about habits. The difference between an amateur and a professional is in their habits. We can't ever be free from our habits. We are a creature of habit. We just have to replace the bad habits with the good ones. And here's how he draws the line. The amateur is driven by passion. They do what they love because they love it, but they lack the commitment to do it when it needs to be done. The sure sign of an amateur is he has a million plans and they all start tomorrow. The amateur waits for fear to disappear before starting and allows resistance to distract them, maybe video games, social media, staying up late. And if anything goes wrong, they just blame external factors. The amateur allows his worth and identity to be defined by others. The amateur craves third-party validation instead of just getting their work done. And here's possibly the biggest lie that the amateur believes. The amateur dreads becoming who she really is because she fears that this new person could be judged by others as different. The tribe will declare us weird or queer or crazy. The tribe will reject us. Here's the truth. The tribe doesn't care one bit. There is no tribe. The gang or posse that we imagine is sustaining us by the bonds we share is in fact a load of individuals who are just as screwed up as we are and just as terrified. Each individual is probably so caught up in their own crap that they don't have 2 seconds to worry about your crap or my crap, and they really don't have time to reject or diminish you just because you're trying something. Now, when we look at the professional by contrast operates from an entirely different foundation. In the book, Stephen lays out 20 characteristics that separate the pro from the amateur. I won't give all of them, but at least 10. The professional shows up every day, stays on the job all day, and is committed over the long haul. For the professional, the stakes are actually high and they are real. The professional is patient. They don't approach their work chaotically. They try to order things. They demystify the work they have to do into separate jobs and do each one of them properly. The professional gets scared of hard things, but they still act in the face of fear and uncertainty anyway. The professional accepts no excuses. They just play it as it lays. They are prepared. They don't show off. The professional dedicates themselves to mastering technique. They do not hesitate to ask for help, and they love it when someone points out how they could do better. They do not take failure or success personally. They just keep going. The professional does not identify with their instrument. They validate themselves just for the act of working, and they will reinvent themselves and use whatever tools are available to them without a preference. The one form of recognition a professional will have is recognition from other professionals. Right. So he says that turning pro is like kicking a drug habit or stopping drinking. It's an actual decision, a decision that you have to commit to and re-enter every day. But it's also a mindset. A lady called Kathy once decided to take up golf. She was terrible at it, like absolutely awful. But what she did immediately was she bought professional equipment, hired a coach to take lessons, and when someone asked her why she was investing so much when she started, she said, "I decided to treat myself as a pro, and within 9 months of taking it seriously, she was a really good golfer." That's it. Like, she changed her identity first and her skills followed. You could be a terrible writer. Stephen's first book was awful, as he self-confesses, but after 7 books, he finally got signed, and he got there. That actually leads me to the next point. Almost every turning pro moment is preceded by an all is lost moment. Again, this ties a bit into metaphor. It's when the hero comes face to face with a lie that they've told themselves, a lie upon which they've based their entire life. And a lie is a self-delusion. It's an act of denial, a cherished belief about ourselves or our prospects. But the specific truth that we confront in the turning pro moment is the realization that we've been avoiding our true calling for our entire lives. We have been beaten by the resistance. We have failed as stewards of our own gifts. We have been amateurs. We have dabbled in things and been dilettantes as opposed to professionals. One of Stephen's friends woke up one morning in a motel room in Bakersfield, California, in the same clothes that she'd been in the night before, with an empty bottle of Jim Beam on a nightstand. When she looked in the mirror, she finally admitted to herself that she was an alcoholic. That was her all is lost moment. Stephen himself turned pro at 31 because he puts it bluntly that if he hadn't, he would have died. He'd realized his trucking was escapism and that no one would write for him, and he moved to a small town with no TV, no radio, no music, no distractions. He ate the same thing every day, and the only thing he was allowed to do was write during the day. Even then, after he took himself seriously, it still took him years and years, with many fallings off the wagon, to establish professional habits, and he actually wrote for 27 years before finally getting his first novel published. Which is crazy, but it shows that if you start out crappy, but you treat yourself as a professional, it is possible to get there, and you could even end up writing one of my favorite books like Stephen has. Another thing he points out is that in the same way that you probably remember where you were when 9/11 happened, you will remember where you were the day that you turned pro. And I can honestly agree with this statement. I started this show, for example, as a fun side project 8 years ago, and I slowly built it up, started to take it more seriously, but even after I went full time on it, I still didn't feel completely pro. I was locked into a 2-episode a week schedule. It's about growth mindset, which is a theory that I didn't invent. It's something that I like to talk about and I really enjoy exploring. But it's still a bit of a day job that I'm super lucky to have and is incredibly close to my ideal, but not quite. Whereas my new show, How to Change the World, about the entire history of everything, is purely the most fantastic version of something I could possibly write with all the skills that I have. Every episode is basically original ideas that haven't been put together before, that takes me like weeks or even a month to gather. And like literally every skill I've learned so far in writing, philosophy, science, from this show, and all the skills from my life in business, science, they all go into this show. And literally every episode is the best thing I could possibly do. And I'm creatively exhausted. There's nothing more I can give. I can't hide behind any excuse. Like with this show, I have deadlines, I have advertisers. Sometimes episodes can be a bit more of a listicle, or I might make decisions because of retention. Whereas with a new one, like there are zero compromises. It's just what I can do to make the most interesting, perfect show that represents my personality. So yes, there's something about what he says in the test of what are you truly capable of that I guess with the new show feels like as my full naked ambition and ability is put to the test on. Whereas this show, I feel like I can still hide behind a few things where I I try to be as honest as I can and do my best with each episode. And I hope you like it. Don't get me wrong. But I guess what I'm saying is I found like a new gear and level of obsession that I'd never had the confidence to even use until I started the new show. And I remember exactly where I was when I put the first episode out, and just the act of like deciding I was going to do it and putting it together. Like I remember everything so clearly. So yes, you will really notice inside yourself when you try to do something that is at the full edge of your capability, and the fear of like there is nothing more to give because there are no excuses for why it isn't better other than you couldn't do better. Anyway, let's move on. So what do you actually get when you turn pro? Well, Stephen says that artists, entrepreneurs receive two salaries. One is monetary and the other is spiritual, which I guess I perhaps alluded to a little bit because the spiritual salary matters more. What we get when we turn pro is we find our power, we find our will and our voice, and we find our self-respect. We become who we always were, but had until then been afraid to embrace and live out. And Stephen says that once he became professional, his work life became like a science. He didn't need outside reinforcement anymore because the work itself brought the satisfaction. And what happens when we turn pro is that we finally listen to that still, small voice inside our heads and find the courage to identify the secret dream or love or bliss that we have known all along was our passion, our calling, our destiny, and we start doing it. And when you do that, energy that was once going into your shadow life, your shadow novel, goes into the real novel. What we once thought was real, the world around us, including its epicenter, ourselves, turns out to only be a shadow, and what had seemed to only be a dream becomes the reality of our lives. However, this can have some costs. When we turn pro, we do give up a bit of life with which we may have become extremely comfortable. We give up our old self that we came to identify with. We may even have to give up friends, lovers, even spouses, and we pass through a membrane when we turn pro. And it hurts, it's messy, it's scary, and you tread in some form of blood when you turn pro. The amateur is out there chasing money or fame, whereas the professional receives something money can't buy, becoming who they were meant to be all along. And once you do turn pro, he says that we are like sharks who have tasted blood. There is no finish line. Life is just about the pursuit. It is the hunt, and will only stop when our heart bursts, and no sooner than that. Now, remember what I said about habits. Up until now, your habits have been habits of resistance, and resistance will tell you anything to keep you from doing your work. Your habits feel like they define you, but resistance is not us. Our current habits are not necessarily ourselves. The voice that you hear in your head, that's not even you either. Those are just thoughts that we think. They're not necessarily our thoughts. They're just resistance telling us to stop and find safety. But the professional learns to recognize that voice and work anyway. The professional doesn't wait for inspiration. He just acts in anticipation of it. The act of starting is where the inspiration then comes from. He even says that 1 bad day is nothing to us. 10 bad days are nothing. The role of a professional is to just maintain composure and keep chipping away because we're pros and not amateurs, and we have patience. There is no course, no product, no guru for turning pro. All you have to do is change your mind. But make no mistake, it's a decision that you have to make and remake every single day. So his question is, what is your version of the typewriter that he had that he kept on avoiding? What have you buried under junk and spare parts? What shadow career are you living that feels tantalizingly close to your real calling, but entails no real risk? Are you the copywriter who wants to be a novelist? Are you that business consultant that wants to be an entrepreneur? Are you a music journalist that wants to be a songwriter? It took him over 30 years to turn pro and then over 20 years to actually get published. But he remembers that first day so well. He sat down for an hour and did some writing, and it was terrible. He knew he hadn't written anything good and that it might be years before he ever would at all. But it didn't matter in that moment. What counted was that he had finally faced his fear and started writing. After years of running from it, he'd sat down and actually done his work. So years from now, I hope you'll remember exactly where you were when you made the decision to do your own work, and you'll remember the day you stopped living a shadow life and started living your real one. The question is, which day will that be, and what will you do? And on that, I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any friends who are good at kicking you up the arse, maybe send them this podcast and they can come back and inspire you a bit more. If you ever wanted to have a chat with me on a Wednesday afternoon, you can do it for free just by booking a call using the link in the description. If you want to hear me doing the absolute best thing I can possibly do on a podcast, then listen to my new show, How to Change the World, where I cannot make it any better than I am currently making it. Maybe in years' time, it will get better and better, but for now, it is the best thing I can possibly make, and I'd love you to listen to it. That is How to Change the World, wherever you get your podcasts, and I can really recommend reading Stephen Pressfield's book, Turning Pro, and also his one called The War of Art. He is a total legend, and I can also recommend searching for any interviews of him because he is awesome. And with that, have a great week. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
Studies show we need time for information to sink in, so I'm going to give you a 5-second pause. Silence. To reflect on one idea from the show before you jump back into your busy life. Ready and go.